Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce FX Hour. My name is Amit, and today we are going to talk about design pattern for Salesforce Git branching strategy. And we have a great speaker with us, Pablo with us. So let me hand over him for his introduction and the presentation. Hand over to you.
Thanks, Amit. And thanks for having me here. So yeah, we're going to talk about design patterns for Git branching strategies. I know that that's a long name. Just a little bit about me. My name is Pablo Gonzalez. I have about 12 years of experience in the Salesforce ecosystem. Some of you may know me as the creator of HappySoup.io, which is a free and open source app for impact analysis. Currently, my focus for the past maybe year and a half has been all things Salesforce DevOps and CI/CD. And I currently work at Salto as the director of Salesforce DevOps. So Salto is a major DevOps product in the Salesforce ecosystem. And so I lead all Salesforce related efforts there. Now, so the agenda for today is we're going to talk about Git-based deployments, as that's a prerequisite to understand what Git branching strategies are. Then we're going to talk about the strategies themselves. We do need to talk a little bit about Git branches versus sandboxes. Then we're going to look at the patterns that are common among all strategies. And then we're going to look at some individual strategies. And we're going to finally talk about which one should you go for. Now, this is an advanced topic. So I'm expecting that if you're here, you already know SFDX and the Salesforce CLI. You are well versed in Salesforce deployments. You know the basics of Git and Git branches, and you understand the concept of continuous integration. If you don't know these things, there are other sessions that can help you, get a grasp of these concepts, but I'm not going to go over any of this, maybe a little bit in detail. Sorry, very high level. But I'm assuming that this is common knowledge among all the people here. All right, so let's talk about Git-based deployments first. So a Git-based deployment is a deployment to a Salesforce org where the metadata that needs to be deployed is kept in a Git branch. So it's different from an org-to-org deployment, right? Like in the chains that you literally take the contents of an org, the metadata of an org, and you deploy it to another org. A Git-based deployment, we don't use that mechanism. Instead, we put certain metadata that we change in a Git branch, and that is kind of the content of that deployment. So typically, you would make the changes in an SFDX repo, and then you commit that to a branch. And ideally, you have a CI server that automatically deploys the entire branch to the target org. That's kind of what a Git-based deployment is. Now, there are different components to make a Git-based deployment possible. First of all, you have to have an SFDX project, and you have to have your changes, whatever changes you're making to your Apex class, custom fields, etc. All that stuff needs to be committed to a Git branch in your project. You also have to have a continuous integration server connected to your Git repo. So this could be, Jenkins, Bitbucket, pipelines, could be GitHub Actions, doesn't matter. And the idea is that the CI server executes SFDX commands against the project that's stored in that Git branch, right? Because what you have in Git is really an SFDX project. So a CI server is able to execute commands against that project, just as if you were doing it yourself in the computer. And the idea is that these commands are what actually deploy the metadata to the target org. So I know that's a lot of text. So that's kind of an image that represents the dynamics or the components of a Git-based deployment. So again, developers make changes to their org. They commit those to a Git branch. And then there's a CI server that is listening to that, and it automatically executes what is known as the build script. And that script is going to then do whatever you want. It could static code analysis, run all tests, but eventually it would deploy to another org. And that's kind of why it's called a Git-based deployment, right? Now, there are certain benefits to using Git-based deployments. The first is that the Git branch represents kind of the desired or to-be state of your production org, right? So it allows for a very easy way to kind of understand the before and after of your changes. Also, because all of this goes in GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, then it makes it easy for someone to, or for your team members to collaborate on that via pull requests. But again, the most important thing is that unlike in a chain set, where you just take metadata from A to B, in a Git-based deployment, the branch represents the desired state. So another way of thinking of a Git-based deployment is that it represents the intent, right? The intention of your changes are now captured in a Git branch. And also, of course, this is what enables continuous integration to happen in the first place. There's a question there: does the developer make the changes directly on the Git branch or on the org? So you would make the changes in the org or in Visual Studio Code. You deploy them to your org, and eventually you commit them to a feature branch. But the changes need to happen at some point, either in Visual Studio Code or in a Salesforce org. Now, there are some challenges to Git-based deployments. If you choose to deploy this way, by having the intent in Git, that opens a huge can of worms. And suddenly you have all these questions. Like, does the main or master branch represent what's already in production? Or does it represent what you want to be in production later on? Also, do we create the feature branches from main? Or do we create them from the development branch or from integration? We don't know, right? It's a question that needs to be answered. Also, should you use feature branches at all? Because there's other mechanisms like trunk-based development where you just commit directly to main. So how do you know if feature branches are a good fit for you or not, or if you should actually use them? Also, should we have one Git branch per Salesforce sandbox, right? So if you have a QA sandbox, UAT sandbox, staging sandbox, does that mean that we need to have one Git branch for each of those sandboxes? Again, it's not clear. Maybe, maybe not. And how does the sandbox strategy affect the Git branching strategy, right? It's kind of what I'm saying. Should there be a one-to-one mapping, or can I have more branches than sandboxes or more sandboxes than branches? And, how do we actually deploy a Git branch to another Salesforce org? Like, does that use, again, do we use Jenkins? Do we use Bitbucket, and etc.? But also when, right? Like, how often do we merge to main? Do we merge to main when we want to deploy to production or when we want to deploy to UAT? So there's just all these questions that suddenly you have to resolve. Like, if you're using chain sets or something else, you don't need to worry about this. But the moment you say, okay, I'm going to deploy with Git, suddenly you have all these problems or all these questions that are not trivial. There isn't an easy answer to these questions. So a Git branching strategy is the answer to those questions. How you choose to answer those questions is what becomes your branching strategy. So you can choose to answer those questions in whatever way you want, whatever way you think benefits your development process more. And those answers shape the branching strategy. Now, another way to think about a Git branching strategy is that it provides a structure or a framework, makes it easy to answer those questions. So you don't have to start from scratch thinking, is main production? When do I merge to main? Should I use feature branches? Using a Git branching strategy kind of puts some structure on that. And it has some sort of pre-answers to those questions. And we can also think about a Git branching strategy as a defined pattern for managing Git branches. So it's a pattern that decides when do we merge them, what each branch represents, etc. So rather than trying to answer all these questions ourselves, we can look at a Git branching strategy that already answered these questions for us, and we just need to adopt that. I'm going to just look here at the questions. Some questions gets a bit too I would have to show a demo, so I can't go into those questions. There's a question here that another question: the Git branch tag and the Git trunk are the same. They're not the same, but I will talk about trunk later on, and I will mention tags as well. Now, before we can deep dive into Git branching strategies, I need to kind of pause and talk about sandboxes versus Git branches, because it's impossible to talk about Git branching strategies without addressing sandboxes. Now, this is a typical, sandbox strategy that I'm sure you've all seen and some of us use, right? Every developer has their own sandbox. Then they commit the changes to a partial copy sandbox, then full or staging, and then eventually production. And you may have also a hotfix sandbox. So Gwen, a question may arise: should I have the same branches than all the sandboxes? And so if we think about it more, actually sandboxes and Git branches have a lot in common. You could even make the argument that sandboxes are kind of a poor mechanism of doing branching in the Salesforce world. So let's think about it, right? If you think, let's say, where does it originate from? Well, a sandbox comes from another sandbox, right? Because you can do sandbox cloning, or it comes from production. A Git branch is the same. It can come from another Git branch. It can come from main, or you can create a branch from another branch. So it's pretty similar, right? They have a starting point, and that starting point can be anything. How do you add changes to that? Well, you make changes on the sandbox, or you deploy changes to the sandbox. Similarly, you can add changes to a Git branch by just committing changes to that branch. So it's, again, conceptually very similar. And also, both sandboxes and Git branches diverge over time from wherever they came from, right? As you start adding stuff to your sandbox, more and more your sandbox is different from the production or sandbox org that it came from. It starts diverging, becomes too different, out of sync. The same is true with Git branches, right? If you create a Git branch 2 months ago, you for sure it's going to be very, very different from the branch that it came from. So if we just look at these three things, it's almost like, well, sandboxes are branches, or they share a lot of the mechanisms or logic behind a branch. Now, there are obviously some huge differences. For example, a sandbox takes hours or days to be created versus a Git branch takes milliseconds. And, how do you actually combine the changes or deploy them in a sandbox? You don't merge a sandbox into another sandbox. You deploy the changes from one sandbox to another, and a Git branch actually gets merged into typically the source branch. Still, like to make the argument that there are a lot of similarities between branches and sandboxes. So then this begs the question: should I just use a Git branch, like just have one single Git branch, like just main, and then use sandboxes as my other branches? Maybe not, right? So I said that sandboxes more or less have the same purpose as Git branches in traditional software development. And that purpose is to allow for isolated development of new features, testing, etc. So again, I ponder the question: are we thinking about sandboxes wrong, right? What if I only had one single branch in Git and use sandboxes as a way of managing differences? Is that the correct approach? I can't tell you. There is no answer to this. And so it may seem weird that I'm asking these questions, even though I don't have an answer, but they are important, because to explain Git branches, we need to understand two things, which is why I went on this tangent. We need to understand that Git branching strategies are only needed if we do Git-based deployments. They are an answer to all the questions that arise from deploying in this way. And two, is that Git branching in Salesforce is weird. It's awkward. It's not straightforward. And that's because we have sandboxes, and they already provide kind of a poor mechanism for branches. So there's always this kind of weird mental mapping that you're thinking, well, does my sandbox represent a branch, or does the branch is the branch in sync to the sandbox? And so I'm only putting this out there because I know when I started learning about Git branching strategies, I was always confused about this sandbox thing. And this sandbox thing was always in my head. So if you have those questions, if you feel that it's not a straightforward topic, or that it's not as clean or easy as in traditional software development, I'm telling you that's okay. That's normal. That's because that's how Salesforce works. So it is a little bit of a weird topic to think about because sandboxes get in the middle. Okay, so we can talk about the actual patterns now. Now there's a question here, can we protect a branch from creating a pull request from it? There are different Git providers provide different ways to protect a branch. So I can't answer that. It depends on what you're using. If you're using GitHub, there are different ways to protect what happens in that branch. I recommend you check the documentation of the Git provider that you're using. And there's a question here, are we assuming Sandbox and Scratch orgs as the same in this scenario? Well, it's kind of the same argument, right? Because if you have a small org and you can use Scratch orgs, like deploy the entire org to a Scratch org, then again, the Scratch org is kind of a feature branch, right? Because you create it, you dispose of it, you can test it, you can deploy it. So again, I will come back to this topic later. I do have kind of an answer to this, but for now, I just want you to kind of think about that it's not straightforward. So the gist of this session is that there are some patterns that are true to all strategies, right? So typically we just consume strategies like Git branching strategies because somebody told us to, or we saw it on a webinar, like this webinar. We saw it on a Dreamforce session. Somebody's using Git Flow or GitHub Flow or trunk-based development, and you just go ahead and implement that. And what I'm trying to do in this session is to make you realize that there are actually some underlying patterns that are true to all of them. And if we understand these patterns, then it's a lot easier to understand why some strategies work the way they work. And it's a lot easier to understand which one would make more sense for us. I will speak later about which branching strategy I would recommend. I see there's a question there. I will recommend that later. So let's talk about the actual patterns. So the first pattern is the mainline. So mainline is basically every single Git repo starts with a single branch, which used to be known as master. Now it's called main. But this is kind of like the mainline is the basis of everything else that you do in that Git repo. It's also known as again, main, master, mainline, trunk. These are all the same things, right? So if you hear, trunk versus main, master, the same concept. Typically, the mainline represents two things. It represents the desired future state of production. It represents those things that have been approved to be in production, and they'll be deployed later on by some other mechanism. But it can also represent, obviously, at a future point, what has already been deployed to production. For most Salesforce teams that use, Git, the mainline represents what's already been deployed to production for most of them. It doesn't have to. I'll talk about other ways to use this. But so see right now, I'm not talking about any branching strategy. I'm not talking about, Git Flow or anything like that. I'm just saying that one of the foundations of any strategy is the fact that there is a mainline. It's known by other words, and it's typically either what should be in production or what is already in production, regardless of the strategy. Oh, and I forgot that most branches originate from main at some point. Now, another pattern is a healthy branch. So a healthy branch is not really, it's not a branch per se. It's a property, it's an attribute of a branch. And typically mainline would be considered a healthy branch. So a healthy branch is a branch that represents a deployable code base. So let me stop for a bit and explain what that means. Let's say that you have put your metadata in, your SFDX project in main, right? That's your mainline. How many of you would be comfortable if I asked you to go right now, like right now, take a pause and go deploy everything that's there, go put it in production right now? Like just stop whatever you're doing, go to main, use SFDX and deploy to production right now. I know a lot of people will be like, well, I don't know, because I don't know, maybe if some changes have happened in production since since the last time we did a deployment, or I'm not sure that main has everything in the way that we would want it in production. So what that means is that it's not a deployable code base. You're not confident about the contents of that branch. If you were fully confident that this is a quote healthy branch, you would have no problem taking that branch and deploying it to production every day at random times, because you are fully confident that nothing that is not in production is not is missing from that branch. So this is kind of the golden standard, right, that we want to get, where we are. Yeah, there's a funny thing here: deploy to main and go sit out of office. That's what most people do, right? So I think obviously this is kind of an ideal state, but again, this is a pattern. It's not a it's a property of a branch, and it could be mainline, but it could be something else. And again, all branching strategies assume that at least one branch is a healthy branch, that is kind of the source of truth, that you can confidently deploy that to a certain environment. So I'm sure, I know this is not true for many of us, but it's kind of the standard, right? Now, another pattern is the feature branch. Again, it's not a strategy, it's just a property or a way of thinking of a branch, where basically every new feature or every change that you have to make to your org is represented by an individual branch. So for example, if you're using Jira and your Jira project is called CRM, you may have a Jira task called CRM235, and you will create a feature branch with those, with that ID. That's kind of the convention, to use feature slash then the name of that ticket number. And you would commit the changes that are related to that feature into that branch. Now, where the feature branch actually comes out of, what is the source of that branch, depends on the branching strategy. It doesn't have to be main, doesn't have to be development. It can be anything, actually, right? There's no restriction. But again, we're not talking about strategies here. We're just talking about the pattern that any branch can represent the contents or the changes that are specifically tied to a business requirement. And the idea of a feature branch is that at some point, it's merged back into the main line, either directly, like we merge that branch directly into main, or through another branch, which is typically a release branch. Speaking of which, another pattern is a release branch, which, like a healthy branch, is not necessarily a branch called release. Yes, you could have a branch called release, but that's not what I'm saying here. A release branch is, again, it's a property of a branch. It's an attribute of any branch. The idea of a release branch is that it holds multiple changes or multiple new features in preparation for being merged into the mainline at some point. So the release branch typically represents a cutoff date. So let's say, for example, you deploy every 2 weeks, and okay, after the 15th of the month, no new features go into the next release. So what you would do is you commit those features to the release branch up until that date. From that date, that release branch is kind of frozen. You can still do development, you can still do other stuff, but just don't merge them into release, because release is now kind of frozen, and it represents the batch of user stories or features or changes that will eventually be merged back into the mainline. The other pattern is the environment branch. Now, this is very common in the Salesforce ecosystem, is very uncommon on traditional software development, mainly because in traditional software development, the concept of environments doesn't really exist. The closest thing to that is it's common for SaaS applications to have like a staging environment. And so, yes, you may have a staging branch, but other than that, it's not too common, right? But in the Salesforce world, I know many people use this kind of pattern. Again, it's not strategy, but the pattern where a branch represents a specific runtime environment, which in our case is a Salesforce org. The other pattern, I will answer some of the questions there. I just want to finish with the patterns first. The other pattern is a hotfix branch, right? Which it's basically a branch that is created on the spot to fix a critical production issue. And this is very nice here that we can see that typically the hotfix branch is created out of the mainline because the mainline is considered a healthy branch. And so we can see how the patterns start now kind of playing together. Okay, maybe you don't create a hotfix branch from main. Maybe you do it from the release branch. Why? Because to you, the release branch is a healthy branch. You are confident about the contents of that branch that you know, okay, we should branch out of here. So I repeat, just because it's very important, that we're not talking about strategies here, we're just talking about patterns, right? And so usually Salesforce teams will have a dev sandbox, a hotfix sandbox. People typically, have this refreshed every day so that it's as close to production as possible. Why? Because production is considered a healthy environment, right? Because it's the source of truth. So even here, we keep seeing these similarities between Git branches and sandboxes, right? We have a hotfix sandbox, but in traditional software development, people have a hotfix branch, right? So there's a question there. Should you also have a hotfix sandbox? It's up to you. You can. I can't tell you, yes, you should have, or no, you shouldn't. There are some scenarios where that makes sense. It depends on how you work. If you're a very small org and you can easily branch out of main and create a feature and create a scratch org, for example, then no, you don't need a hotfix sandbox. You just need a scratch org where you create those, fix those changes and you push it back to main and deploy to production, and that's it. I know that's idealistic, but it does happen. So I can't answer if you should or you shouldn't. Yeah. What I can answer is that you should have some mechanism for hot fixing things. What that mechanism is will depend on you. There's a question here, how do we manage destructive changes? There's no native way to do that, right? So Git doesn't know anything about Salesforce. So if you delete some Git files, there's nothing that will tell Git, well, now you need to delete these files in the Salesforce org, right? So for that, you need to use SFDX, and the Salesforce CLI has different commands to deploy destructive changes. Okay, just need some water. Now there's a question here, what is your opinion on having only one integration branch and deploying to QA, SIT, and UAT instead of one branch per environment and promoting up the chain? I'll talk about that later. It's one of the slides. Just hang in there. All right, so let's talk, now that we know kind of the patterns, right? We saw the healthy branch, the feature branch, release branch, hotfix branch. Now we can look at the actual strategies that build on top of those patterns. These are the strategies that a lot of people use in the ecosystem and outside the ecosystem. So the first one is Git Flow. It's very simple. You basically have your main, again, your main line where everything comes out of, and it assumes that you work with sprints or some iteration that is time boxed, right? So typically a sprint. So what you do is you create a develop or development branch out of main at the beginning of that sprint, and then you create feature branches out of development. See, I said earlier, feature branches don't have to come out of main. They can come out of anywhere you want. But in this strategy, it's been decided for you that they are branched out from develop. So this is also an example where I said that the branching strategy can answer some of those questions about Git-based deployments for you, so you don't have to come up with them. So if you adopt this strategy, kind of the standard is that feature branches come out of development, period. Don't think about it. Just, you can use that if you choose. Eventually, the feature branches get merged into development, and you can either merge development back into main, or you can also use release branches. right? So here, this other branch here, it is basically a release. So again, you have your main branch, which is the main line. You create a development branch at the beginning of the sprint. People start creating feature branches out of that. But then when you're ready to release, you cherry pick some of those commits into a release branch, and that's what gets deployed, or that's what gets merged into main. So just in this strategy, we can see different patterns, right? We can see the mainline pattern. We can see the healthy branch is also main. In this case, also the development branch is a healthy branch in relation to the feature branches. The feature branches originate from development because everyone else is merging changes onto development. So it represents kind of the latest changes of the entire team. So from that point of view, it's considered a healthy branch that I can take my feature branches from. So hopefully you can see, right, that all the patterns are kind of hidden behind this strategy. Right. So another strategy here is the Git Flow, not to be confused. Sorry, GitHub Flow. The previous one is Git Flow. This one is GitHub Flow. This one, there are only two patterns there, which is the mainline and feature branches. So this one is a lot easier. You don't have a development branch. You don't have a release branch. You basically just branch out of main or master. You commit your changes to that feature branch, and eventually you merge feature branch back into master. And that's it. Now, I know there are questions, but what about my sandboxes? What about QA and UAT? And I'll get there. I promise. But this is another, branching strategy. So what is a potential implementation for this in Salesforce? I'm actually getting to it right now. I thought it was in a slide much later, but I'm going to get to it right now. How could this work in Salesforce, right? How could you just have main and master? What about all my other sandboxes? Well, one possible, again, potential, don't take this as a recipe, but one potential way this could work is you create a feature branch out of main. You connect that feature branch to your sandbox in Visual Studio Code. You make your changes there, and you commit those changes to that feature branch, right? Then you push the feature branch to the remote repository. And the creation of the feature branch, just creating the feature branch, automatically triggers a continuous integration job that does a Git-based deployment of the contents of that feature branch to a QA sandbox. I'm not saying there's not even a pull request or anything. It's just creating that branch, right? Or you could even say create a pull request, and creating the pull request automatically deploys to QA. So we don't have a QA branch. We're still just feature branch and master branch. It's just that the moment it got created, or the moment the pull request is created, we immediately deploy to QA. We say this is ready for testing. I'm not confident that it can be deployed to production, but we can test it. So go to QA. Somebody does QA and it passes. And so then you merge the branch into main. But we still don't deploy to production, because let's say main for us represents what should be deployed by business users, what we have high confidence that will make it to production, just not yet. So we now just have all the changes in main, and when you commit to main, it gets deployed to UAT. Again, Git-based deployment via continuous integration server deploys to UAT. Let's say somebody does UAT testing and it passes, then you can add a tag on production on the main branch. You can add a Git tag that says, okay, release version 1, 2, 3. You tag the main line, and that again triggers a CI job that deploys the entire main branch to production. So in this way, we have completely decoupled sandboxes from Git branches. We are basically using sandboxes as a test target, or as a test environment, or a runtime environment, whatever you want to call it. But it's just a mechanism for somebody to test changes in different ways. But it has nothing to do with your Git branches. You still have only two Git branches, main and feature branch. Now, here's the other branching strategy that, again, I said is very common. I don't know that it has a name, so I'm going to call it org-based branching strategy, where basically you have one Git branch per Salesforce sandbox. So you have a staging branch, a UAT branch, QA branch, and the master branch represents production. Now, this branching strategy, I think, was popularized by Copado. So Copado actually has a very good video on YouTube. So I'm just putting a screenshot here that explains how they use this strategy, and I think it's very smart. However, what it means is that if you're going to use this strategy, you probably need some mechanism to manage all the complexity for you. Like, I wouldn't use this strategy without something like Copado or Geoset or Salto or Rabbit, because it's just too many branches, right? Like, every environment is a branch. The more branches, the more merge conflicts, the more they deviate from each other. It just becomes too messy. So I wouldn't use it unless it was the branching strategy from one of these vendors. So like Copado successfully uses that. I know there are some questions there, and I will get to it in a moment. Now, the big question is, right, which one should I use? But before I answer that, hopefully you've learned a lot of good things here. You've seen the patterns, right? You understand that Git branching strategies are needed to answer the questions of doing Git-based deployments. You also understand that the difference between sandboxes and Git branches is not clear. It's not obvious. I can't tell you exactly what the difference should be or the official answer. Nobody knows. It's a bit of a confusing topic, but you are aware of that. That's a plus. Now you also know the patterns, right? Mainline, healthy branch, feature branch, release branch. And you've seen 3 strategies, and you can see how those patterns are present in all those strategies. Now, obviously, the question is, okay, but which one is good for me? So I can tell you. It depends. So I can give you some considerations. I recommend that you start with the simplest strategy possible, which is the GitHub Flow strategy, which is the one that I explained in more detail, where I said, you create a PR, you deploy to QA, then you merge to main, which deploys to UAT, and then you create a tag, and that deploys to production. That basically decouples your sandboxes from Git. So if you can start with that, I highly recommend it. Another consideration is I would really like, all you 96 people, 94 people that are in this presentation, to go after this session, just think about this sandbox versus Git thing. We need more people in the ecosystem to challenge this way. Again, I don't have an answer on whether we should have a Git branch per sandbox, or whether sandboxes are meant to be branches, or are they meant to represent like test environments or test targets. But I would like you to think about it. I would like you to contemplate it, really think about it, really think, have we been thought the wrong thing? Have I been thinking about this the wrong thing? And see if you can come up with an answer for yourself, because I could use more people thinking about this. So think about that when you decide, which branching strategy should I use. Now, if you deploy on a set schedule, right? If you have a very well-defined schedule because your company imposes that or your team is comfortable with that, then release branches may be a good fit. Again, release branches are not part of any strategy specifically. They're mentioned in the Git Flow strategy as an alternative to lock releases, but they're not part of that strategy. They're just a pattern. So regardless of what you use, what strategy, if you release on a cadence that is fixed and that works for you, think whether release branches are actually a good idea for you. Now, the more branches you have, so if you go with the org-based branching, the Copado branching strategy, if you do this yourself, the higher the complexity, more chances, not changes, more chances for merge conflicts, more confusion, which is the source of truth, which branch represents what, where do I merge from, where does the feature branch come out of, do I need promotion branches, do I need release branches, do I need a back promotion branch? It creates a huge kind of worms. So I don't recommend this strategy, again, unless you use a product that manages this for you. Now, if I can, I guess my goal for this session, like the most important thing for me, is I would like you to, in addition to the sandbox versus Git thing, I would like you to think about this. What if from tomorrow, or not tomorrow, tomorrow's Saturday, but what if from Monday, your team was forced to use this strategy? I say, okay, from Monday, 9 a.m., you have to use main and feature branch, nothing else. And you don't have a choice. You're gonna have to change to this. What would need to happen for this to work? Right? I get a lot of pushback on this. Oh no, but I need to have one branch per org because I want to check how is the branch different from the org because somebody could have made changes on the org. So you're trying to use Git to bypass or to fix a governance process, right? Why are people making changes in the org and not going through Git? I don't know. So that's one argument that people give me, right? There are other ones like, okay, but how do I keep org as a metadata that is different for each org? Like maybe name credentials or email addresses and email alerts, all that stuff is different for each org. So I need a different branch per org. But maybe you don't. There's a feature from SFDX called SFDX string replacements, where you can replace values dynamically at runtime before you deploy. It's GA. You can also have in your SFDX project different folders. Salesforce DX support any folder structure you want. So you could also have different folders where you keep the org specific metadata. So you could have a UAT folder, QA folder, etc. for those metadatas that are different. So there's all these arguments that people will make by no, I need my branch per org. But again, I just want you to think about this. What would happen to your development process if from Monday morning you had to use this? Maybe you would realize that some stuff you're not doing it right. Maybe you realize that, yeah, people are making changes in UAT when they shouldn't. Maybe you realize that you haven't thought about the differences between your sandboxes. Why are they misaligned? Maybe you realize that you have been thinking about sandboxes wrong the whole time. I don't know. I don't have an answer. But I want you to think about this, right? What will need to be changed in my company for this to work? And is it doable? Can I actually do it? And what are the supposed requirements that I have? Are they real requirements or can I achieve them in some other way? So that's it. That's the presentation. I hope you found this useful. So thank you very much for being here. I'm gonna go through some of the questions and see which ones I can answer. And if you have more questions, please throw them there. Oh, there's a lot of questions. Let's see. All right, so two people are asking about trunk-based development, and I didn't show it. So trunk-based development is similar to Git Flow. So it's similar to this. Honestly, it's the same. Now, some people will kill me for saying it's the same. It's not the same, but the difference is in trunk-based development, you don't create a feature branch. You have main on your computer and you make the changes directly there. And then you commit the changes from your main to the remote main. It's still a feature branch because your local representation is still isolated from the remote mainline. So whether you want to call it feature branch or just my local copy of main, there's no difference. Same thing. So trunk-based development is very similar to this. I think it's a bit easier to keep things in a feature branch because you may be working in different features at the same time. So, but conceptually, they're very, very similar. This question here: how can we manage hotfix defects and regular stories in the same pipeline? Good question. If you use a hotfix sandbox and a hotfix branch, you always have this problem where you fix the problem there, you deploy to production, but now what? Now all your sandboxes are out of sync because all the sandboxes below that still have the defect. It's still there. So you get into all these things of, okay, now I need to do back promotions and I need to, make the sandboxes out of sync. So ideally, you could fix the hotfix at the lowest environment. Fix it in the source. Don't skip the pipeline. Fix it where it came from, and then deploy it all the way up. Now, some people say, well, but it takes too long because the pipeline takes too long. Okay, well, maybe you need to figure out a process for hotfixes to go through the pipeline a bit faster than normal stuff. There's a question here for CI jobs. Which CLI is more robust, SFDX or Cumulus CI? I would recommend the SFCLI simply because Cumulus CI was optimized for managed packages. And unless if you are developing managed packages, then probably Cumulus CI has a lot of good things for you. Now, I know some people use Cumulus CI for org-based development, but I haven't, so I can't recommend it. I recommend you use the Salesforce CLI. There's a question here on data seeding. Salesforce data templates only look at master data relationship. I think this is out of the scope of this discussion, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to skip this one. There's a question: what if each developer has their own org and need to integrate the code as developers before pushing to QA? Right. So this is obviously a problem, right? So if every developer has their own sandbox, they're all doing their own thing, and they're deploying to QA or to integration. So QA or integration has the integrated changes of everyone else. That's great. But every individual developer doesn't. And that's a problem because then they're working off of a out-of-date version of the iteration that everyone else is working on. There's no easy answer for that. There are two answers. If you're using sandboxes, ideally, before you commit to QA or to integration, you would do a Git pull. Pull whatever's in the integration branch, pull it to your SFDX project, deploy to your own sandbox, test again that your feature still works, and then then commit your feature branch to integration or QA. That way your feature branch will have those changes as well in there. Sorry, and the second part of that question is if you're using Scratch orgs and you can fully use Scratch orgs because you're a small org and it's very easy for you, then basically you create Scratch orgs on the fly from the main branch, and everyone is committing to main. So everyone gets a production-like environment as quickly as possible. Again, and that's not easy to do. Wow, Amit, there are too many questions. What do we do?
First of all, thank you so much for a great session. I will say we will post this question, this video on FX our YouTube channel, and feel free to post the question over there so that later in the day or time we can post the answer. I hope all of you are running late for your next meeting. So if you can pick couple of one, Pablo, that will be great. Or rest of them, we will be asked people to put on that YouTube video.
Yeah, okay. Let's see here. It says from Barbara, with GitHub Flow, what if you only want to deploy to production a new feature branch and not all of them, but they're all merged into main? Yeah, this is also a common problem. And it seems to only be a problem in the Salesforce world. Like this is very uncommon in traditional software development. You have this sprint and you have all these 10 features and you deploy 10 features to UAT, to the UAT sandbox, and to the main branch. And then the business says, oh, well, actually, we don't want those 5. We just want those other ones. Now what? Now, if I deploy main, I'm going to deploy a bunch of stuff that I didn't want to, or the business decided at the last minute that they didn't want to. No easy answer. One consideration is we should be open to change, right? That's how software is. If the business says, well, the requirement changed, then so be it. That's agile software development. Requirements change all the time. So we should be open to that. Second, ideally, you would only put stories on the sprint that have been properly estimated. What's the, I'm trying to use it. What's the word for groom? Because you can't use groom anymore. Because they've been validated, refined. Yeah, exactly. They've been refined. The business has said, yes, this is what we want. They have good acceptance criteria, good tests. Then, if you do that good Scrum work, you minimize the chances of one of those stories suddenly being pulled out of the sprint. It doesn't answer the question, but I'm saying you should do more of that, right? Um, the third option is that, okay, well, then maybe then you need a release branch. Then maybe if that's a thing that happens often, then you need a branch before main. You need to maybe commit to a development branch, which is the other strategy, the Git Flow. And from development, when you know which ones will be deployed, then you create a release branch, and then you just commit those that you eventually want to deploy. Again, there's no easy answer. This is one of the things that many of the Salesforce DevOps products, like again Salto, Copado, Rabbit, Gearset, they do a lot of this magic stuff for you that you can choose different requirements or different stories out of order and deploy them regardless of what other stuff was on the pipeline. Hopefully that answers your question. There's a question here. I heard you say GitHub Flow strategy. Does that still involve changes in the sandbox? Yeah, all strategies assume that you make changes to a Salesforce environment, right? Obviously, when we talk about Git and all that, we are always thinking of code, right? On VS Code and all that, but you have to test that code somewhere, right? And that code may need some new custom fields. So all that stuff has to happen in a Salesforce org. So 100%, all of these strategies assume that you have a development sandbox or a Scratch org. Now, do I see any difference in patterns when it comes to package development and standalone Salesforce implementation? And the patterns, no. The patterns are kind of universal to package to software development. Even in package-based development, you would say, okay, when do we create a new package version? From a healthy branch, right? Because you need a branch that you feel confident that, hey, we need a new version of this package, then it's a healthy branch. It could also be a release branch. So it's two patterns mixed in the same concept, right? But so the patterns are universal in my opinion to all development models and all branching strategies. There are just too many questions, so I think I'm gonna have